Well, good morning. Hi, thanks for joining me. This is Anthony Parent of IRS Medic, and this is a story that we've been watching and following and being a part of. Our friend Fabian has been successful in getting some attention to his case about the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act and the Privacy Act, GDPR. And it's amazing. So I guess good with me today is a longtime guest, Keith Renman and John Richardson. Keith, you want to give the background exactly what happened and your impression of what happened, what Fabian and his group of accidental Americans accomplished regarding the
Well,
incredibly aggressive FATCA regulation.
I'll do my best because I've been so concentrating on helping individuals right at the moment because it's been so many people. Um, I just know that Fabienne is pursuing different judicial routes in getting FATCA, if you will, overturned in Europe, and that it's a violation of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And this is the highest court so far that it has gone to. So we'll see what happens. I'm sorry, I can't give any more detail than that, but I think through the course of our podcast, and especially with John's slides, we can go through that detail. But I know Fabien and his and the people with whom he's been working have been very diligent in trying to get this FATCA law overturned in Europe. So good for him to get it up to this level, if you will,
Yeah, yeah.
in the European judicial system.
But you could say that FATCA is causing a lot of people to call you, though, right now.
Well, it is just because a couple different levels. The obvious level is not being able to maintain their bank account or open a bank account, but not just a bank account, not being able to open an investment account in their country of residence, which just that in itself is a problem. But that also lends itself to another problem, which could be for another podcast. That even though you may it might be a blessing in disguise that you can't open an investment account in your country of residence because that could be quite detrimental to you if you are in the U.S. tax system or need to be. So it's a very complicated issue. It
Yeah.
really is.
And it's going on,
Vast.
and so you're dealing with the blowback of it. And by the way, this is something that we follow on Key's Facebook group. So this is where the discussion is on this. This is, I think, where the most
Yeah.
robust
Well,
discussion.
the blowback is that if accidental Americans tend not to be in the U.S. tax system, okay, and some Americans overseas, but other Americans overseas are in the U.S. tax system, and they're so focused on not being able to open up an investment account in their country of residence because of FATCA, because they identify them as a U.S. citizen, so therefore they're forbidden to have that investment account. So what I've been telling people is that could be a blessing in disguise because if you
Yeah,
start opening investment accounts in your country of residence,
yeah,
if you happen to be in the US tax system or need to be in the future, it can really be harmful for you. You need to take a look ahead of time. But again, be proactive on what you're going to be investing in. But that's a separate topic,
got it.
but
Yeah,
it's
yeah, got it,
still
got it. Right. Well, and you're gonna have to hop. You're gonna have to hop off. But I do want people that
at
you are
8:30. At
thinking where
8:30,
you're
I'm
having some
good.
issues. Reach out to Keith on how this is impacting you. He sort of, there's a lot of U.S. expats basically in crisis, and I mean that's really it is in financial crisis where all these things that kind of pushed off, not thinking about. Now it's sort of time to act. So I want to. So we'll get to that. So thanks for that, Keith. And yeah, the if you do want, and this is sort of where a lot of the discussion is. And let me just share my screen of. Get this here. Just want to get this here of Fabian's press release on this, just to kind of give some. Hide that. Okay, let me get this here going here. I got a lot of things going on. All right, and let me just start this and get this. And okay, so you should now see. Come on, there we go. There we go. Okay, so in Keith's group, this is Fabian's. This is really true. This is the most important press release that I've ever shared. Opportunity to share it before you read it. Just going over here and the people that helped him out. And then this is the press release is actually, where's the LinkedIn page? Right here. Yeah, here it is. So here is the press release explaining what it is. And I'll give the link to that. I'll put this link in the super chat right now if anyone wants to check it out. Right now, it is in there. Yeah, there you go. All right. So now you have that. Now with that setting the stage, this is sort of what I want to get into. And I see our regulars and joining to us, Gabe, Andrew, great to see you guys this morning. And this is kind of where I want to start off the discussion. Then I'm going to go to the background a little bit. I don't want to dominate this discussion, but this is sort of the thing that I'm bothered with all the time. In the United States of America, okay, this is the truth. Now, people try to rewrite this, but as the nation was founded, no question about it, fundamental rights come from God. It's very clear. That's where fundamental rights come from. The common law establishes that. Very much so, that's where they come from. Now, this is the question, and by the way, our judiciary, our legal system is inherited from England. But now France has a civil code. It's not common law based. And so the question is sort of that's on my mind is where do fundamental rights come from Europe? That's sort of the question to ask. And we're not going to answer that now, but I wanted to now just to set that as a preface to what I really call the FATCA humiliation ritual. That's really what it is. It's a total humiliation ritual. This entire thing, top to bottom, who's required to do what, the fear that, and the fact is this: FATCA does require every bank to examine everyone and report anyone who is suspected of being an American. So there's nothing really in there to stop the wholesale export of personal data for people who aren't even Americans. Yeah. And so it goes to some database. And we know American databases aren't secure. We know they get hacked. And we also know the government goes into things and snoops for whatever reasons they want to. So,
and keep in mind, Anthony, and that's not the focus of our conversation today, but there is another population that's adversely affected by FATCA. And those are other countries' expats living in the United States, where they're having their bank accounts closed back in their countries of origin because of having U.S. indicia, meaning a U.S. address.
They're suspected of being American. There you go. Exactly. Yeah. There it is. So now I'm going to turn over the discussion to John Richardson. We have some slides to go over today. I went through these already. Very nice. But these slides aren't yours, John, right?
No, absolutely not. The slides, giving a shout out, come from somebody who is very well versed on this whole issue in Europe. Okay.
Oh, cool.
Obviously, I've communicating with over the years, who had a nice set of slides, and why reinvent such good stuff? Gave me permission to use them, but I acknowledge his work. He doesn't want to be named, but I acknowledge his work and thank him for the slides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, right on. Now, you did have a setup you wanted to get to, John, I think, right?
I need a little background before we start getting into this.
Yeah. So, do you want me to just pull up that email you sent me?
Well, I don't know if I want the exact email pulled up.
All right.
Well, look here. Let me pull it up.
I can read it. How about if I read it? You want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So this is what we have. So FATCA is, and this, you said what would Justice Brandeis? What's that?
Read it. I know the gist of it. Okay. So look, everybody. Here's the basic conflict here. Okay. So as we'll see in the slides, Europe actually does, at least post World War II, have a tradition of recognizing individual privacy rights. Okay. And these are reflected in various documents starting in 1950. And actually the GDPR, which stands for General Data Protection Regulation, really is sort of the next evolution of that. Hence the title of the presentation, the GDPR Human Rights Tool for the Digital Age. But here's the thing, okay? That's a European concept. America, I know although they think they have this stuff, it's really very little, sense of privacy rights. We all know that. Everybody looks at what's actually going on. In fact, to a very large extent, right, the purpose of FATCA, all right, was in fact to, force the disclosure of information without regard to privacy rights. And I think this is important. The whole point of the IGAs was to generously allow other countries to amend their domestic legislation to actually effectively legislate FATCA, so that FATCA would not, in and of itself, be the tool to override the privacy rights. Now, so this is why I think I use the phrase irresistible force, FATCA, right? irresistible force and attack of privacy rights versus immovable object, okay, which I think we can say is sort of the GDPR, right? Now, there's been a lot of litigation over FATCA over the years. And what's interesting is that, and this is obvious, right, that the nature of the litigation has to reflect the legal tools that are available in whatever country. So we have, starting with Republicans overseas, in 2014, I think the FATCA legal action lawsuit that largely was arguing this based on, Fourth Amendment privacy rights, et cetera, almost unheard of. They of course lost for standing issues. There was the Canadian lawsuit, which I was involved in, that we ran for, must have been about 11 years. That was based on alleged violations of the Canadian Charter of Rights. The Supreme Court refused to hear that case. And then we have a variety of different lawsuits in Europe that are, it seems to be even aimed at various aspects of FATCA, including the GDPR. And the Jennings lawsuit, for example, right, was a very similar kind of thing, arguing that FATCA violated the GDPR, et cetera. But the bottom line is that all of the lawsuits against FATCA basically have failed to date, all right? With the exception of some wins in lower courts, of which the Belgium thing, would be one. But what has happened is that this has now reached the highest court in Europe, a court that I understand has the jurisdiction to decide the issue for all of the European countries. Okay, and and for that reason, it does have value. Now, the point I want to make, though, before we get into this actual discussion is this, okay? That all of this is rooted, obviously, in the U.S. extraterritorial tax regime, that is citizenship taxation. The primary goal of citizenship taxation, and the only functional meaning that it has, is to claim the residents of other countries as U.S. tax residents, to kind of swoop in, say, we'll take this one, we'll take this one, these are our taxpayers now. Okay. And in my view, none of these things are going to win until that becomes the central issue. Can the United States swoop into other countries and do? Okay.
Yeah, Joe, I want to just step in here because we'll get into it, but we've got a great comment from software. It really is exactly kind of what the thing I was looking for, because just something that bugs me, and this is exactly right. How can we expect fairness? U.S. Supreme Court based FATCA and warrantless domestic bank searches on the third-party doctrine, reasonable expectation of privacy, and all this. Exactly. This is the problem that we have. And as I was thinking about what's going on here, is that this is essentially it. The U.S. government's illegality is being exported. That's essentially what it is, because it's very easy to find a case that would blow, FBAR FATCA out of the water. Here, let me just show you what it is. And I found the case very easy that blows this entire idea that you need to file an FBAR. Here it is, Boyd versus United States, kind of an old case here, 1886. In this case, it's essentially the same thing as an FBAR. Hey, defendant, you better produce your private books, invoice, or papers to us. You better present it to us, or we'll if you don't, we'll consider the allegations of the attorney on the other side to be valid. So right here, they're like, yeah, no, that's unconstitutional and void. So anything like this that puts an obligation on you to report or else, it violates the Constitution very clearly. Somehow the Supreme Court doesn't have access to their own documents to find this stuff. Interesting, very interesting. And I think what we're having here is a right to privacy does not exist in the constitutions, right? They actually don't. Really, what we need to look at is the limited powers of the government and where they're claiming to get this. We'll get into that now. Thank you for that. Thank you for indulging me on that, John. Now let's get back to the slides. All right, I'm at your direction.
To do with the issue, Anthony, because this has to do, at this particular moment, right, with the European court's interpretation of this, not the U.S. at all. And I think it's important to understand that, because look, so let's imagine a situation where the European Court of Justice decides that FATCA violates the GDPR. Okay. So what? I mean, the point is that, that they've agreed to this U.S. law, and, they still have to deal with that as a problem. Now, I agree that it's somewhat helpful, but it is absolutely not the case. It is absolutely not the case that a ruling that FATCA violates the GDPR will end this issue. Absolutely not.
No.
Because they've signed on to this, and the U.S. government probably will say, "Well, isn't that interesting?" Or whatever.
Yeah.
But the point is that until this is framed, this is my opinion, but I feel very strongly about this. Until this issue is framed as trying to export U.S. taxations directly into other countries, I think it's unlikely that this is actually going to go anywhere.
I think it's very unlikely it will for different reasons, but kind of related but different. But yeah, we'll get into that. And my point was more like this, John. If the Supreme Court did its job, FATCA would have been overturned, and Europe wouldn't have to rule on it. That was my point.
Yeah, but that's not where we are.
No, that's not where we are. No.
We're not going to do its job. I mean, we see this time after time.
Yeah.
Now, I don't deny. I think that this is very, very helpful. I mean, I think that anything that attacks FATCA, citizenship taxation, is helpful. But look, before we get into these slides, let's look at the effects of FATCA and sort of see, how this challenge interacts with those, right? So the first thing about FATCA is that it's very clearly to expand the scope of the U.S. tax system into other countries, right? So that's a citizenship taxation issue. That's not being addressed, okay? My personal view, and this is only my personal view, is that is a huge mistake because that's the real issue here, okay? Right? In other words, say you get FATCA struck down, you've still got the problem of citizenship taxation, okay? The second problem with FATCA is the bank account issue. And this is access to financial accounts. This is an issue all over the world. Okay, it is not a narrow group of people in Europe. I see this in Canada all the time. It's a huge issue. People getting letters, explain why, you meet the limitation of benefits clause and a tax. This is all over the world. Okay, there's no question about it. The third problem is this massive, massive, massive imposition of costs, right, on the financial institutions of other countries. You may recall Elise Bean in 2017 clearly saying that it was good that these other countries' financial institutions had these costs imposed on them to make sure that they had, sort of equivalent costs to U.S. Financial institutions, et cetera, right? And then we have, as another category, the issue of whether, these FATCA IGAs, whether they conflict with local privacy laws. That's what this is about. Okay, that's what this is about. It's helpful, it's narrow, but it doesn't address the issue of citizenship taxation. In fact, it largely assumes the viability of citizenship taxation, because one of the arguments is that FATCA goes too far. It violates the requirement of proportionality. Why? Because many Americans abroad can use the foreign earned income exclusion.
Oh, you know what? I see. You know what? The whole proportionality agreement. So, all right, let's get into it. I'll bring it up then.
So here we go. Anyway, right. So here's we'll go through this presentation. It's
okay. Here's the first slide. Okay.
Okay, well, examples of human rights. Actually, if we look at this, I mean, how many of these do you really feel you have anywhere? Right to life? Well, if you have a death penalty, you've violated that. Agreed?
Well, there's a due process. You have a right to life under due process of the law. So,
I don't know. I would think a right to life would preclude the death penalty, okay, being imposed. But anyway, freedom of expression, right to a fair trial. I mean, this freedom of thought, conscience, religion. As long as you don't talk about it.
Yeah, and by the way, John, I don't disagree with you overall. No, there's no right to life. I mean, on many, many levels. So I agree, 100% agree with you. I don't want to make a technical thing.
Anyway, this is the background of this stuff. Right. Next.
Right. And just something from Andrew. He just, this is the right to privacy is the right to be secure. Something about. Okay. Next. Okay.
Okay, so if we look at these European instruments, the European Convention of Human Rights, interestingly, Article 8, specifically, talks about privacy, a private and family life, your correspondence, etc. So this is interesting. So we have here a convention that actually lists some of this stuff in a more specific kind of way, right? Next.
Interesting. This is so interesting.
And so all of this starts after the horrors of World War II. And there wasn't the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the European Covenant on Human Rights was a response to World War II, this sort of thing. Obviously, an attempt to, because remember that, I wasn't there and you weren't there, but my understanding of it is that, that one of the ways that the tyranny was facilitated was by violating privacy rights, et cetera. So that's why, Europe, and understandably so, has a conscience.
Oh, God.
It's not that they're better people. It's that they have, in recent history, they can see what happens if you don't have privacy rights. So next.
Well, I would just say, look, I think a lot of this narrative is a Cold War narrative. And we need to understand that this is a particular narrative advanced, that it might not be the truth, that a lot of things are not true whatsoever, because one of the things that was completely excused was the 20 million Christians killed by the Bolshevik Jews in World War II. We don't talk about that. And then the Germans were tortured and brutalized. And then Dresden. There's so many war crimes all around, but hey, only one guy committed them. And that's that's the problem of it. And that's where we see that, look, when we look at what was really the purpose of World War II, you start asking some hard questions. And then you're like, you know what? It looks like the United States just wanted to control European Union. And again, when you start looking at Cold War stuff, you will see the CIA is bragging that it is controlling the European Union. And that is one of the things you need to understand. And this explains so much about why the European Union will allow FATCA to rule over them, why every tax treaty benefits the United States, why every time there's a situation, you can count on any foreign leader to roll over for the whims of the United States. And that is because the European Union was, at least at one time, proudly controlled by the CIA. They don't seem to mention it as much right now, but I'm not sure when did the CIA hand over power to the people of Europe? I don't think that ever happened. So I think that's something to understand in all of this, is that the European Union itself isn't exactly an organic representative body of Europeans, and it constantly sells them out, constantly, because it actually is a foreign power that rules over Europeans. That's just the way it is.
So last week, I saw the movie Nuremberg. If it's available for wherever you live, if you're listening.
Yeah, don't watch that.
Fantastic movie. It was a fantastic.
No, it is not. John, there was no due process in those trials. Any attorney saying that that's a good thing, dude, there's no due process there.
I'm saying
I think we're going down not a very good path here, gentlemen.
It was a great movie. Okay, it was a great movie.
Propaganda. Let's go.
Okay, so moving on from the European Convention of Human Rights, we have the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. But again, so this is an evolution. But notice also that Article 8 explicitly establishes the right to the protection of personal data, right? Now think about that for a minute, okay? That is extraordinary, right? Your data belongs to you, etc. Okay, next. Okay, so I think that's, sort of a repeat of what we just saw, okay? But in other words, personal data matters, okay? And that includes bank account information, etc. So continuing on here.
Yep.
Now, when you analyze this from the perspective of European law, all right, and let's think about a rule that requires, number one, people of U.S. nationality to be identified, targeted, and their information turned over to the United States. So there is a proportionality principle. In other words, it's possible to achieve this as a goal, subject to things including proportionality, which means that it has to be provided by law. Maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, this is why it would be important for FATCA IGAs to be legislated as law, serve a legitimate public interest.
Forgot about those. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why that's why you're really saying not making citizenship-based taxation a part of this sort of takes away that proportionality, because look, we're going to do a massive data sweep because a small percentage of people here may be Americans.
Well, that's part of it. Okay, but another part of the argument is that, and this was, this has been argued. I think it was argued. It may have been argued in Jenny's case, but I've seen this around as part of the proportionality argument that because many Americans abroad don't owe taxes anyway, okay, that this just simply goes too far, etc. Now, I'm not expressing an opinion on whether I think that's a good or a bad argument, but it is an argument that has been raised in conjunction with the proportionality issue. Okay, and then Article 47 affected, whatever.
I mean, it's just interesting because now what that requires is requires the European Union to discuss, interpret U.S. law to see, well, does this U.S. law really require all of this? So you're making the European Union kind of try to decide. So anyway.
Well, I think that there's some truth to that, right? Because look, quite obviously, anybody who understood this who really understood citizenship taxation would never make the claim that somehow U.S. citizens, don't owe U.S. tax because of the foreign earned income exclusion. I mean, it's simply false on its face, and it ignores all the disabilities imposed by U.S. citizenship taxation in terms of local investing and stuff. So, that's the way the argument's laid out. I don't agree with it, though. But
yeah, well, and the other issue is like, well, because if I was on the other side, it's like, well, we're not worried about not reported wages. We're worried about big income and bank accounts. That's what I think the counter argument would be to that. So I don't think it's a great way to go either. My point.
Anyway, continuing on.
Yep.
All right, so we have the whole FATCA rollout in terms of the IGAs in 2014, right?
Yeah.
We have the GDPR becoming a thing in, I think, 2018. Now, part of the discussion in relation to this is, in fact, based on the recognition that the FATCA IGAs predate the GDPR, et cetera, right? But let's think about what's happening contextually. So all these countries sign these FATCA IGAs saying, we'll do this, blah, blah, blah. Most of them, I think, are amending domestic laws to facilitate this as well. And then all of a sudden, the GDPR comes along that, seems to call into question the legality of aspects of the FATCA IGAs, right? So that's kind of where we are. All right. In other words, that's one of the issues here. Does the fact that the FATCA IGAs predate the GDPR, does that matter? And if so, why does it matter? But anyway, continuing on. So again, this whole GDPR thing it's again, full disclosure, it's not my area of expertise at all. But this seems to me to be accurate based on everything I read. Is that just think about it for a minute, okay? The whole thing here is to make data something that the person owns and can be used, with the consent of the person. And these are some principles. Notice data will keep only the data needed for the stated purpose, will retain data no longer than necessary, et cetera. But part of the problem here, as we'll see, is the sending this over to the United States. And the GDPR requires that once the information leaves, that it's subject to the same kind of rules. And it's really difficult, to make the argument that anything sent to the IRS will somehow be restricted to that purpose, given that they've already agreed to turn over information to the information enforcement people, right? I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, it's absurd to believe it's secure.
I know that if it leaves, okay, that it's no longer secure if it leaves the European Union. But anyway, next.
Yeah, and I guess I'm reading these bullet points and I'm just laughing. You know, when you have FATCA in your mind and you're reading this, like, and I think this is my point. Look, if the GDPR, which is actually different in country to country, if the GDPR doesn't protect against FATCA, why bother having it? Why, like, your number one risk is the United States of America. That's your fact. Why bother having a GDPR if it can't stop FATCA? Because you look at every single one of these things and it.
Well, but remember, it protects people locally, right? It would protect people from, local European laws as well. But I agree with you that, that FATCA and the CRS and that are huge problems, right? Anything to do with tax administration. But anyway, let's see where this goes.
Keep going. All right, we'll keep going. Where are we going here? All right.
Okay. This is just sort of, these are specific expressions, okay, of the notion that the data is owned by the individual, right, and not by the government, et cetera. But anyway, next.
Well, and I just want to go over this. This is sort of the thing that I'm kind of in my mind here as I'm going is that we're our rights derive from common law, and the civil code allows, I think it does, for more positivist claims that your rights come from the government. And so that's kind of what's constantly in my mind, that we have a U.S.-based system that should respect fundamental rights, but often ignores it. And then we have a European system, which I'm not entirely sure, but ultimately, are humans different? Humans are humans. Human rights are human rights. Fundamental rights are fundamental rights. And I think that's one problem is, like, you go to countries that they don't respect fundamental rights, including the United States. But that's just a bigger problem. So I think that's kind of interesting. And that the discussion on the super chat is over, like Andrew says, one side of the wall is private, the other side of the wall is public. Like, that's really what we should have. What's the, now, and this is the thing too, GDPR isn't necessarily for government restriction, but it's for, hey, look, I did business with this website and I don't want them to have my information and spam me with a whole bunch of marketing things.
It certainly includes that. And of course, we know that, their view is that applies to anybody, accessing these websites, et cetera. So, and that's why, you've seen this, huge growth and, do you accept cookies and blah, blah, this sort of stuff, right, since the GDPR. Yeah. But anyway, this is not just, okay, to protect people from the United States. It's a general recognition of privacy rights and, I think, ownership of personal data. But anyway, okay, so continuing. Notice also, again, the focus on proportionality and necessity. So, I mean, one might ask the question, okay, does a principle that identifies people based only on nationality and nothing else, right? Can that be necessary and proportionate for tax enforcement? Well, it's a bold claim. I guess the answer is, if it's citizenship taxation, maybe. And that is why, again, the key to winning this thing long run is to challenge the assumption that the United States has the right to come in to other countries, look around, and claim the residents of other countries as their own tax residents, okay? But they don't want to do this. They don't want to. And the problem that they want to keep citizenship taxation. They want to leave it alone. They claim that, well, this is an internal tax matter and the United States can do what it wants. I very much disagree with that. It's okay for the United States to have any tax system it wants when it applies to people inside the country, but it's not okay for the U.S. to export its tax system into other countries and claim the residents of other countries as their own tax residents.
Yeah, well, on this slide, John, what's really, sort of that asterisk there, John? That asterisk right there, because Keith, I'm going through this here, right? And I'm thinking about my clients. I'm not in Europe. I'm thinking about my clients. I'm going like, okay, have my clients been told to the right to information? Have they been told what data has been processed by why and who receives it? Have they been given a copy? Can they get a copy of their data? Do they have do any of these things apply? And I think that asterisk there, Keith, what's that asterisk doing to all those rights?
Yeah, good question. I do know it depends on the financial institution. So, for example, in France, the BNP Paribas, for example, they will just send out a notice to the customer stating that your information has been transmitted via FATCA to the IRS. Another financial institution, Bread, actually gives details of actually what is being transmitted. So it just depends on where you're banking, on what information you're aware of that's being sent.
Wow. And I would just say, and I think that, because that asterisk says, hey, look, we can ignore this when we feel it's necessary and proportionate to a specific public interest. That is, our public interest can overwrite your rights, which is basically, well, that doesn't mean you don't have any rights. That's a very clever way to say you don't have any rights.
And that's the question. Is it in the public interest for the United States to be able to come in and claim your own tax residences there? Is it or is it not?
Yeah. I don't think so.
Well, again, FATCA will intercept a 30% wire, outbound wire to these banks, and so the bank would fail. So there it is. There's the argument. Well, if you don't comply, so obviously, being a little silly here.
Is it in the public interest for countries to allow the United States to come in at your expense to identify people who meet certain criteria, turn them over to the United States? In other words, let the United States claim the residents of other countries as U.S. tax residents. Is that in the public interest? Yes or no?
Yeah, I'm going to say no.
Well, I think the answer is obviously no, unless you're one of these tax professors that somehow thinks citizenship tax is okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, my point here is this. There's all this, jabbering about this, that, and the other thing, but all roads lead back to citizenship taxation. So it's high time that all people involved in this kind of litigation find a way to incorporate that into the issue, right? Anyway, next.
And guys, I am seeing the comments. I'll get those. Great discussion going on in the chat. I'll get to that. I want to get through these, and Keith's got to hop off in a little bit. So really keep the discussion going. I see it. It's great.
Focuses on what happens when the information leaves the country, right? And I alluded to that earlier. I mean, does anybody seriously think that when this information leaves Europe, that somehow it's going to be protected? I mean, that's an absurd claim.
If one adequacy, the use as the destination country provides adequate level of protection. Oh God! Oh, that's hilarious. Okay, that doesn't exist. In the absence of adequate legally binding instruments containing appropriate safeguards can ensure protection. Well, that doesn't have any protection.
Anthony, all you need to do is point out that the IRS has agreed to give immigration enforcement personal tax. That's all you need to do to shoot all this down. That's it. There's no possibility of that information, taxpayer information, being treated according to these required guidelines once it arrives at the American border. None. Okay. And I think anybody who, whatever. Next. We all know that, even if it can't be proven. Next. Now, these shout out again to the person who put the slides together. These are, I think, a response to my request to use this presentation today. He added some slides, so thank you for this. So, FATCA versus the GDPR. Okay, so, we see where this leads. Are the FATCA IGAs consistent with the principles of necessity and proportionality? Obviously not, but here are some reasons why. Appropriate safeguards, IGA confidentially you can't be serious. Okay, there's no possibility that any information that leaves Europe under FATCA is going to be protected in this way. Proportionality, very broad U.S. indicia. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And then, of course, we have a complicating factor that I alluded to earlier, that the FATCA IGAs predate the GDPR. There is an Article 96 grandfathering issue here, etc. But I mean, that's, you see, I think part of the problem is that this Article 96 grandfathering thing gives these European courts a way out of the problem, right? And just say, that it's a pre-existing kind of thing. Anyway, next. Legal base applies for FATCA transfers. Well, let's see. I mean, okay, so these are, this is sort of in point form, a summary of everything we've been talking about. Look, all that's happening is that what FATCA does is these countries sign on to, at their expense, to force their financial institutions to look around and identify people based on only nationality, nothing more, and then turn over all their information to the United States, or kick them out of their banking arrangement. And that's what it is, okay?
Now I'm just I'm looking at the bullet point for appropriate safeguards, Article 46. Okay, the IGAs are binding legal instruments. Well, one thing we always kind of mentioned was that these IGAs sort of are like treaties, but they're not ratified by the U.S. Senate. That's one argument that comes up there. So I would think that would be one argument to bring up, to say, hey, look, these IGAs aren't necessarily even ratified by the proper people in the United States of America. So,
yeah. Okay, on that point, can you open the link I sent you on the Canada-U.S. tax treaty?
Yeah. Let me get that. Yep, you got it. And there you go. Okay.
Okay, get down to Article 29. I think it's 29.
Man, I guess I'm glad they taught us Roman numerals. That's 24 XXIX, right?
Okay, stop there. Move up. Sorry. Exchange of information. It was 27. Sorry.
27. Now,
the way the FATCA IGAs are justified, right? If you were to open, I don't want you to do it, but if you were open to a FATCA IGA, they start with recitals that, typically say, well, we already have a tax treaty with you, and that tax treaty includes exchange of information. Now, I want you to move down slowly. I think it's provision 8. Go slowly though.
Well, we get to.
Hold on. See what the next article is, 28. Go down a little further. No,
28.
Sorry, move up again. Move up again. Where is it? Sorry, I'm not seeing it. Just a minute. Hold on. Keep going.
Down?
Okay, stop there. Now, I want you to see paragraph 3. Now, not all tax treaties have this, but some do. Now remember this, right? The basic principle is, now you're talking about the constitutionality of this stuff, right? And tax treaties and, how they do this. So in putting the FATCA IGAs together, they've sort of viewed them as an extension of the existing treaties.
Oh.
If they're an extension of existing treaties, then the existing treaty should be part of it. Now look at what we have here. In no case, sorry, can you get rid of the blue for a minute so I can read it?
You bet. Yep.
Okay. So it says, in no case shall the provisions of 1 or 2, right? That's the exchange of information. Now we go down to C, to supply information which would disclose any trade, business, blah, blah, blah. Or, now take a look at the last line after the word or information, the disclosure of which would be contrary to public policy. Okay, you see that? In other words, in many of the existing tax treaties, there's a provision that allows the requested party, in this case, the IGA partner, to refuse to disclose when, it would be contrary to the public interest. Now, my argument on this is, right, that there's no possible way that it's consistent with public policy for a country to turn over information about its own tax residents. All right, you know, to the IRS. Now, what that does is it opens the door to legitimately argue that, okay, so we'll go along with this FATCA IGA, but only with respect to people who are not residents of our country, right? Only with respect to, you know, the US resident out there, you know, trying to hide money in a bank account in Canada or something, right? This is how absurd this is. But so my point is that that should be acknowledged, and I believe should be used to argue that, I mean, it's not necessarily an all or nothing thing, that the FATCA IGAs could continue, but public policy requires a protection of our own tax residents. Okay, in other words, you can't just come in and claim our residents as your tax residents. In other words, if you apply this only to, you know, the US resident tax cheat who's hiding money in a Canadian bank, right? Then okay, we'll turn that information over. But not, okay, if it's you know, US patriot moved to Canada, has lived in Canada for 50 years and is a Canadian citizen, right? No, we won't do that. And that's bolstered by another part of the treaty that basically says Canada will not assist the United States in enforcement of a tax debt on somebody who's a Canadian citizen. In other words, it blends well with that. So I think that I think that this stuff, you know, really should have become part of the overall argument here, because these FATCA IGAs, they didn't quite come out of nowhere. Okay, you know, the way they put these together is an extension to existing tax treaties, and therefore, to the extent that a tax treaty has no, we won't exchange information if it's contrary to public policy, I think that that's a useful fact. Okay, but in any case, going back to the slides.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for that explanation of.
Okay, so, you know, next. Well, you know, I mean, here's a suggestion for, you know, again, this is sort of another example of what I just said is, you know, like how could you restrict the application of FATCA to make it somehow tolerable, right? You know, make it consistent with the GDPR. Well, narrowing of indicia, reportable accounts, deliver on promise of reciprocity. I don't think that. I think that the lack of reciprocity might strengthen the public policy argument. Same country exemption, RBT. If you focus on those two, that's where I think the key may actually be, because that's saying, you know, if this really was designed, you know, for you to find your resident tax cheats, all right, we'll go along with that. But no, we're not going to go along with letting you come into our country and claim our tax residents as your tax residents, right? And I think that that would be a useful discussion to have, right? But anyway, so what the idea here is that maybe FATCA, the whole way it's applied, could be tweaked so it wasn't so blatantly inconsistent with the GDPR. Maybe. Okay, maybe. Next.
And we have reached the end. There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
So, you know, what's the prognosis here? Look, let's say that the European Court of Justice says, yeah, you know, FATCA violates the GDPR. So where are we then? Well, you know, we're in a situation where a court says that FATCA violates the GDPR, yet these countries have signed these FATCA IGAs. From the United States point of view, the answer is, well, that's your problem. It's not our problem. You know, I mean, you agree to this, etc. You know, this shows you again, you know, without attacking this from the citizenship taxation angle, I'm not sure, you know, that you're further ahead. The problem is that there's no situation where the court of a foreign country could say somehow could change U.S. law on this, right? And change the fact that these countries have agreed to U.S. law, unless it's somehow unlawful for a country to agree to a provision that violates the GDPR. But I don't believe that's the case. So I don't know how much further ahead we are. I mean, I think this is good. I think that all attacks on this are very good. They're very helpful, and I agree that this is an important achievement.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think it's that anything that brings this issue to the forefront and sort of explains it, I think is a good thing. Now, and I know Keith, you have to hop off.
Yeah.
What are what's your sort of final reaction to this presentation, Keith? What's your overall sense here?
Well, no, like you just said, I think it's a good thing because it just brings the absurdity of this situation to the forefront. So we'll just have to see where it goes. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I know Fabien Company are quite passionate, and I mean, they're just keep moving forward with it. So let's see what happens.
See where it goes. Yeah, right on. All right. So we've got some great comments here, and we've got some great comments, and I want to get to this. And this is one, and it's great. These two comments answered each other right in a row. I love it.
What's that?
Hang on a second, because okay, here it is. Poor habit. Thank you so much for joining us today. Basically, what do you? I like your icon there. What do you think the reaction would be if China started doing CBT? Well, the next comment answers it. And this is the thing: the dollar is the proprietary product of the Federal Reserve. Okay, it's true. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank. They own the money. It's not corporate money, and they actually dictate the terms on it. And so that's actually the reason why FATCA kind of went through. Because and so the reason why it wouldn't work if China did it, because China doesn't have the reserve currency of the world. The reason why the U.S. has global taxation is because it wants to be the global currency, and so that's sort of the global control, command and control. Here's who gets the money. Here's who we take the money from globally. So that's really the understanding of what citizenship-based taxation is really all about. It's so that the Federal Reserve can control the world. That's really what it's about. That's why we see these things happening in the way they do. Now, I'm going to say that as I'm going through this, you know what? This is where the GDPR is putting me into positivist law hell. That's what it's doing to me in my mind, because, boy, is this reminding me of something. Boy, when there's a big protection that claims your rights are protected, this and that, and they mean absolutely nothing. What does that remind me of? Well, it's this, folks. Here it is. I got it right here. This is the same thing. This is, wait, wrong one. Let me add what I want to add. Here you go. Boy, does this remind me of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. A total nonsense argument that's not enforceable, but saying you have the right to this, this, and this, and when they violate the rights, nothing happens. We have a right to a fair and just... They actually say that. And so this is kind of one of the reasons why, we are seeing the GDPR as, again, one of these positivist law nightmares where this law is saying, oh, you have a right to this, but there's nothing behind it. There's absolutely nothing behind the GDPR. There's nothing, because they can define every single thing about it. The individual, the public has nothing. Your rights are only what the overseeing government, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve, says it is. That's the truth of the matter. And so I think that's really the whole problem when you have these Bill of Rights that don't mean anything, and it's worse than nothing. And I think that's actually my point. Is it's much better to be ruled by a tyrant. Well, then you know the truth. But this positivist law has these trappings of actually fundamental law. They use these words to say, oh, you see, we're protecting your rights, but they do the exact opposite. These are not, GDPR isn't. I don't look at it as really a legitimate law because it's allowing this. It's not. It's defining. You're defining law, and really think about it. GDPR, that last word is regulation. Regulation defines what your fundamental rights are. Do you like that? This regulation, there's your fundamental rights in the regulation. Really nice, really cute. So that's really the thing that I wanted that's what's really bugging me about this. About that. So we're getting a lot more comments coming in here. Really appreciate it. And then, we have Bill of Rights. Thank you very much. In the Bill of Rights, where the public interests outweigh individual rights. And that's the whole thing with positivist law, because when you're looking at the regulation, oh, there's my rights, government. Dude, I don't care what you put in there. I don't care what you write in there. My rights exist. Whatever your document says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your document says. I have a right to be secure. You don't have a right to go into my private affairs. Now, again, that's the law, U.S. law. But in other countries, it's like, well, I think that's the problem. We don't necessarily recognize those fundamental rights. Even though European was historically Europe, and again, it's the foundation of Christianity, and the common law is derived from Christianity. Yet we kind of have this weird thing going on here. And again, I think it's because Europe is essentially controlled by its foreign enemies, the United States of America and the Federal Reserve. Let's see here. Let me get to here. Let's see. What is a defined? This is always the thing. What's a defined public good? What do we mean by that? What do we mean by public good? Who's public? Who is public and who is private? And I think one way they do this is by saying, well, we want to take your stuff, therefore your rights are public. And that's kind of what they do. And we've seen that in the big place, which is completely obnoxious, is in the public rights doctrine as described in Murray's lease. And I think this is a good way to go, because the government says, well, you don't necessarily have a right to a jury trial when it comes to taxes, because taxes are really just sort of your public right. Yeah, we might destroy. And so essentially, it was Murray's lease in 1848, which has been expanded to something completely absurd. In that case, a federal employee was caught embezzling and then was fired. That person said, well, no, you can't fire me until you give me a full trial with the right to jury. And the Supreme Court said, what are you talking about? Your right to public employment is a public right. It's not an individual right to you. You don't have a fundamental right to a government job. That is the 1848 case that created the public rights doctrine. Now, the same government says, well, your stuff funds the public, so therefore you get tax court. You're not entitled to anything. Yeah, we could totally destroy you. But again, we're talking about taxes. And so we're going to exempt that. And that's always what they do there. And so hopefully that case sort of goes away here. And I know we're out of time, and there's a few things. Yeah, the money. Yeah, they have we're getting a few more. We're running out of time here. I wonder how right. That's right. Great comment. The Ahmed Vina. I wonder, we'll treat it, especially when the U.S. just published how its national security strategy document that the U.S. is not happy.
I was thinking about actually incorporating that into the discussion today. So thanks very much for that.
Great comment. Yeah.
If the national security document, if the interpretation of it is correct, it absolutely would strengthen the argument that everything to do with FATCA is inconsistent with public policy. I also think that if that is in fact the case, I think FATCA and CBT are finished anyway, because the only way the United States can enforce this is if there's a sense that they're part of a club of, sort of like-minded countries. And rightly or wrongly, that national security document is perceived as the United States taking the position that, they're not going to be part of sort of, the European club anymore, et cetera. And so I think that although it wouldn't be part of the public discussion, I think that's definitely a factor here, no question.
Yeah, that's something, right? That maybe there'd be something there. Few things I want to get to here. This is another great. This Walks with Hawks. Thank you for this one. And this is really it. And as soon as we get to that interpretation, that word right there is the interpretation. Why do things need to be interpreted? If they need to be interpreted, then they're not clear. Then documents are not valid. Why are we interpreting it? And I think that's one big problem that again, and I've talked with Andy and a lot of people about this, and sort of undoing my law school conditioning. That Marbury versus Madison in the 1804 case, just decided by Chief Justice John Marshall, he interpreted the Constitution you look at the Constitution, it says, hey, where does the Supreme Court get to identify, interpret the Constitution of what's in there and not in there? And it's not. And John Marshall grabbed a bunch of federal power for the Supreme Court, but what it did is actually emboldened the entire federal government. And the entire federal government benefited from this idea that the Supreme Court can define what is and isn't in the Constitution. And the contrived case of Marbury versus Madison, that was a totally contrived case. It wasn't quite organic as you think. It was just a design. So do that. And then 10 years later, McCulloch versus Maryland, John Marshall found that the power for a central bank in the Constitution, even though it wasn't there, just saying, well, it should be in there. And that's really what we get into. The foundation of most of the Supreme Court jurisprudence goes back to John Marshall. In law school, John Marshall is regarded as a hero. Thank God for him. Otherwise, the people would have a voice. And otherwise, John Marshall knew better, though. He always knew better for his foreign sponsors. Central banks. He was a big fan of that. So that's really what we have. I think one problem we need to get to is there. Now, somebody just had this comment here, and this was really, really good. Man, did this get me thinking. It was right. Oh, right. Rob. Boy, Rob, I've been thinking about that. You put that there. And I think you're right. Thank you very much. Thank you. By the way, thank you, Rob. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you understand. Common law was for nobles and knights. And this is sort of what I'm captivated by. That, I don't know, 80, 90% of the people have no idea what's going on. No idea what's going on legally, have no idea what's going on. Maybe even 95% of people. People are still watching, football and doing all of that. They're completely clueless as to what the law is, what the foundation is, what it even means that someone is a sovereign. Do they even know what a sovereign means? Do they know what the people is? And so in my mind, I'm like, well, what's going to happen here? And how did the Magna Carta come about? It wasn't the commoners who brought the Magna Carta about, but you're correct. It was the nobles and the knights saying this is nonsense. And so that what you end up being is the nobles and knights end up being sovereign, and then they have the people underneath them who aren't, but that's their choice, sort of. They don't want it. I just want to be told what to do. And I think you end up, that is sort of the truth about it. That is the truth. The common law was for nobles and knights. That is actually a really good point, because that one problem that you have is people don't have interest in preserving their own rights. They don't even have the ability, or they don't have the ability. And they've been so confused, so brainwashed, so poisoned. I think that is really where we might be going. And things, when we look at, can the U.S. empire exist forever? Probably not. No empire ever existed forever. And what's the closest analogy? Well, I think the Roman Empire is the closest analogy. And then what happened after the Roman Empire fell? Well, what we ended up with was that we ended up with lords and we ended up with serfs, a feudal system. Now, it's claimed to be the worst thing in the world. I'm not sure if it is. There was a lot of, pluses and minuses, but essentially, maybe what we're just sort of talking about is taking the power away from the morons in government and giving it to nobles and knights who actually know things and do things. And maybe that's really my argument. Could be, but thanks for that comment, Rob. I really, that's given me some things to think about. Here we go. Good morning, Borchelle. Like-minded country, they are all happy to comply. They can't help it. But again, where do these leaders go to school? Most of them, you'll see at some point they went to a U.S.-based school. So they pick up the whole U.S.-centricness anyway. And I don't know European politics that much, but I do remember there was a quote, where do failed politicians go in Europe? And they go to the EU, right? That's where you go when you fail and you're elected out. Well, now you're in charge of the entire EU. I think there's some truth to that one. Let's see here what we got here. We got more come. Miller and Katz were which Miller and Katz were the two worst SCOTUS cases? Really? Which Miller? I'm not sure which one you're talking about. Send me in the comments which one you're talking about. Then we'll get into doctrines. Whenever you hear doctrine, this is a good. Whenever you hear this phrase, I always love it. This is a tip that Andrew got me. Whenever you hear the word doctrine, that means a person isn't talking about the law. They're making it up. They're creating a doctrine that's not there in the Constitution. Whenever you see that word doctrine, you can do where is that found in the Constitution? Oh, it's not. It's made up. Rome fell. Is that where? I don't know when Rome fell. 1432. All right. The EU is about to fall. Well, I think it fell or whatever. It's fallen. All right. So I think we got to wrap it up there. I am going to be hopping on. By the way, I am going to be hopping on. I'm going to do a live podcast at 10 o'clock today. I do really enjoy discussing these issues where we kind of take hey, what's the law, the regulations, statute? How does this, compare to what the law should be? I like comparing the both. But sometimes I don't actually go through and discuss the actual tax issues. We just sort of go through them, but we do have that corporal need. Someone had that word up there before for tax compliance. So I am going to be discussing with our tax director at 10 o'clock today, Eastern, decision for a lot of people, whether you have a controlled foreign corporation, whether or not you should check the box or regard the entity. That is something that we'll be doing that. It's a technical thing, perhaps not as fun as this. I'll be doing that at 10 with Michael today, and look for some of those. The Byzantine Empire was Rome, correct? Oh, my favorite word, deemed. Oh, my favorite word, deemed. Oh, you know it. Extra legal. These are all the things. All right. Beautiful. And again, I want to thank John, and I do want to give, if you are thinking of renouncing, I guess, I don't know where we're going to go, right? If you're going to go to the EU, you're still going to be subject there. But if you are thinking of renouncing, and it definitely happens, I got to say, John Richardson, reach out to John for some of these very difficult cases, especially when there's a foreign pension involved. John is one of the top experts, as you know. He knows these issues deeper than most, and he will not know. He knows he's sort of the source material. So I want to thank John and thank whoever created those slides. Do I know the person?
I doubt it.
Okay. But yeah, again, thanks, John, for bringing this up. Really, really helpful. I understand a lot better myself. Thanks so much for this. What are your final words of wisdom?
Well, we live in difficult times, right? I mean, I don't know where the viewers are from, but if you watch what's happening from, outside the United States, outside Europe, et cetera. I mean, there are a lot of things that are going on today that I think are extraordinarily bad judgment. And we'll see, how that washes up on the beach. But I think that, what is clear from all of this is that, individuals do not matter in the least. And
No.
You've got to take massive steps to protect yourselves. Just on the level of simple things. You need multiple banks, you need multiple this, you need multiple that. Those who are fortunate enough to be able to have multiple citizenships or multiple residencies should protect that kind of stuff. What's striking about all of these discussions, where they all are at one, regardless of what country you're in, is that individual people do not matter. To the extent that there's a democratic process been hijacked, by political parties, etc. So look out for yourselves. I guess that's all I can say.
Yeah. It's crazy. Thank you, John. And we are living through interesting times. And just quickly, it was United States versus Miller, is what Software was mentioning before. Arguably a terrible case, saying that your bank records are not your papers. As the court said, documents were business records.
Well, the thing is that you got to understand that what these things are is they're reflections of culture of society. And the United States does not have a culture of privacy or really much of a culture of the recognition of individual rights. And, therefore, if these are things you value, then, I think you need to look elsewhere. And it's getting 1,000 times worse with this, complete shift, at least for a certain generation, into the digital age, right? So, I don't know.
All right. Well, so next week we're going to be talking about the hazardous investments to have as an American. So that should be, basically if you, depending on the circumstances of your birth, your life, and who you are, you may or may not want to invest in something. Isn't that something? That's what we're going to be discussing next week. So I'm looking forward to that. And again, I want to thank, boy, I really do enjoy this. YouTube is sort of, blacklisting this channel a little bit. So the people we get, and this is actually going to be my final thought. This is going to be my final thought. And I think the people on here, let's think about the Magna Carta. Let's think about that for a second. Was that's a document that restrains the power of a king. Okay. Now, how was a king compelled to sign a Magna Carta? And the answer is, and we had the answer from the comment above. For nobles and knights. The nobles and knights were the ones who made the Magna Carta happen. The public at large had nothing to do with it. It was the knights and the nobles. They were the ones who started the fundamental right revolution. Really, well, actually, it was Jesus Christ, but they were the ones who brought it to Europe. They said, "This is it." So that is, I think, something to think about. That when we are looking for reform and a government to respect our rights, the idea that we need to get the public to agree to us, who doesn't even know what we're talking about, is not necessarily found in history. History shows a determined minority of people who are working for truth and justice and the benefit of society will prevail. That's what history shows us. So maybe that's something we need to think about, something perhaps outside the political process, because people don't even know what they're voting for. And we're given selections that none of us like. We always are picking from the worst of two evils, which means we have an evil government. That's what we have. If that's what you're doing, the worst of two, that means everybody in the government is evil. So I think this is where it's going. And I think that's hopefully where, I think to start thinking about that. Thinking about that, we'll never get probably more than 5% of the people ever interested in this, but that's all we need. That's all we need, folks. You corner nuts, it's still a turn. There we go. Beautiful. All right, we'll finish with that. All right, thank you, everyone. See you next time.